the problem is plain and simple. We are more divided than ever. There is more ignorance and lack of information than ever, and there's more willingness to have dialogue. Less willingness to have dialogue about these kinds of confrontations anymore. And it's because not only these last 2 years have we been living our lives isolated and online, but perhaps from more than a decade, at least amongst young people, that should have the most influence on culture at this point. And they are one of the most silent, unfortunately.
Hey everyone, welcome back to our CSANT podcast. I am Amanda, one of the hosts, and today we are joined by Harry Wade. Thank you for joining us today. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. My name's Harry. I moved to Canada, to London, Ontario in 2010 when I was just 10 years old with my parents and my 3 siblings. In 2018 I enrolled at UWO in the engineering program. In the following year I qualified for chemical biomedical engineering in a competitive program, and I was enjoying university life like most students choose and hope to enjoy. But in 2020, when they announced COVID, they forced everyone to go home and classes were cancelled, and then it was very uncertain whether or not we were going to have exams or not, and in last minute it was decided that we would crush the remainder of our curriculum into the last week or so before exams. And a lot of people took advantage of this because we didn't have the infrastructure like we do now with like Zoom and proctoring. So people were just allowed to go home and write their exams together with all their friends. And I wasn't like that. I'd like to think I held my education to a higher standard. So I withdrew from the program immediately, dissatisfied, and I probably wouldn't have been able to maintain my placement with the people I'm competing against in the program having such an edge on me. So I withdrew, and once it was announced that the following year was going to be online as well, I took a year off. But then in 2021, I saw things were getting worse before they were getting better. So I went back with the expectation that I would receive pushback, but not to this extent. So I went into a simpler stream, civil engineering, and it only took 2 months, really only a month for them to bar me, but it took them 2 months to have me arrested simply for trying to attend class. So I've been arrested 4 times. I have 3 civil trespass charges and 1 criminal trespass. Criminal mischief is what it's called. And that happened a few weeks after my first string of free arrests where I was just trying to attend class. My 4th arrest, I tried to return to campus outside an open forum and just try and ask the students to get their opinions on how they felt about the mandates, about my issue, my story. And within 20 minutes they had me removed because the most damning thing, the biggest threat I pose is having dialogue and talking to people about these issues, which is why I'm always grateful to have opportunities to talk.
Awesome. What was the response you were getting from students when you were talking to them on campus?
People that I would be in contact with on campus are in the same hiding spots as me, because all these buildings are being supervised constantly, making sure everyone's alone at a table, always masked when they're not eating, and all these other kinds of rules. Using my 2 prior years of university experience, I knew where there would be classrooms that weren't being used and unsupervised, and it seemed like other students knew that as well. So I know there was 2 rooms on campus where I could go, where I wouldn't be disturbed, and there was a few other students that knew that as well. And you foster a friendship that way because you see other people in the same room not wearing masks. It's like, we have a common understanding, let's chat about this. But what differentiated me from them and everyone else is that I'm not vaccinated, but I didn't disclose my vaccination status, most importantly. But these guys, one way or another, with their creed exemptions, or they have this vaccine, even though they choose not to wear a mask, and they do that whenever they can in the comfort of their own privacy, they're not being removed from campus, even though there are some of the people that are just as adamant about having these mandates removed as I am. So I'm telling them in person, these friends, some of them in my class, some of them from different years, this is what's happening to me. These are the routine threats I'm receiving. I've already been trespassed against, yet I'm still able to go to class and fulfill all my academic obligations. But it wasn't until they revoked my online access where I had to make a public stand by going to class maskless. That was the final straw with the university. And I told all my peers that would listen, like, this is coming. And there was at least 10 of them that said, we won't let this happen, Harry. We'll make sure our voices are heard. We'll make sure they know that this is an unpopular decision in the classroom. And then when the day finally came, I had high hopes because the professor stepped out to make his phone call to the special constables, and about a third of the classroom took their masks off.
Wow.
And I thought it was an act of solidarity, but the truth revealed itself when the professor stepped back in and the masks were back on, because they're just doing it for their own comfort. And even amongst the students themselves, the student body, when a third of them take their masks off, maybe they don't have that regard for their peers the way they think these masks and all these other mandates are for like a communal or public safety purpose, because these students are more than comfortable to take these masks off when they're unsupervised, like all the parties I've been to, all the fraternities I've visited, even till now, just a few weeks ago, as we're in the midst of this new variant and online and rising case numbers, students were taking their masks off long before this, and they're still doing it just when nobody's watching. So the professor re-enters the room. After about 20 minutes, while he resumed his class, the special constables arrived and they arrested me in front of the class. And people were filming, but not guaranteed to have my best interest while they're filming. Maybe because they enjoy the public ridicule. They enjoy the 5-minute hates, so to speak, right? So yeah, some people may have celebrated that fact, but once it went online, I'd say the reception was more or less balanced. And I know personally the direct support I've received has been overwhelmingly positive. And to my benefit, it's because of my limited exposure online and being involved in media. I think that's something we could all benefit from at this point. But I think out of all of it, I've only received 2 hate messages, someone saying I'm deluded and someone else saying that I should go back to my country. And obviously these are Canadians that are meant to like value immigration and liberty. And as the university professor said, the one that called the special constables to have me removed, only a month prior said university is a place that is tolerant and accepting of all beliefs, ethnicities, genders, and what have you. And then only a month later, having me removed from the class. But you can't be surprised when most of these professors are being replaced and having their positions filled by people that aren't qualified, people on sabbatical, and people that shouldn't be allowed to be an authority on this issue, when I know at least one of my professors who claims to represent the rights and interests of women, the feminist movement, the trans movement, while he works on projects in Saudi Arabia, one of the countries that has one of the worst human rights records in history. But we seem to ignore that. And we always ignore that when our economies are so deeply entangled with these countries such as Saudi Arabia, other Middle Eastern countries, and China. We seem to ignore the human rights violations for the sake of the economy. And that's something Canadians are becoming more and more comfortable with, which is what's the most distressing part of this for me.
Wow, that was that was a lot, but thank you for sharing. So I feel like a lot of students are scared to put their education on the line the way that you have. What is your plan now, looking, forward, that your school has expelled you, if I'm correct?
Yep.
What are your future plans that what are you planning on doing now? Is it I don't know, what's your...
I guess I'm just doing what I've been doing my whole life, and all I could ask of anyone else is living my life the way I want to. And I had the same aspirations as everyone else. I wanted education, a career, wealth, to have a family and to have success and access in society. And that's what everyone wants, but at what cost at the end of the day? And students know in their heart of hearts that the education they receive now is not at the standard that they are still paying for, right? Like a lot of these classes are being taught with videos used in previous years, and yet we still pay full price. And most students are willing to admit that they don't really pay for an education anymore. They pay for access. It's very easy to get the numbers needed to impress upon your employer in a professional setting, which is why, you know, most employers, most of the legitimate ones anyway, will say, we don't really care about your academic credentials or how you perform at university. We just hope that these grades, your degree, is an account of your commitment and willingness to, well, on the one hand, swallow BS, really, the bureaucracy of these institutions, willing to tolerate being told what to do and what views are acceptable and what not. That might be more valuable to an employer than any education they receive. And if that's the kind of life that students want to live, then that's entirely up to them. But I know that it was only a few years ago that students could have asked better and they could have demanded more, and they've forgotten that the power lies with them. They pay their tuition. That's what maintains a campus. That's what pays for these professors that they receive this education from. And now these professors say, just watch the video online, and if you have questions, you can ask me. And that's not what we paid them for. And we didn't even see a decrease in the amount of tuition costs. And the university reaps the benefit of that, right? Because they're able to limit the expenditure of running these institutions while still maintaining integrity in the fact that they still hold all the cards in terms of having the only available option in terms of receiving a high standard of education in this country. I think people need to ask themselves, what does education really mean in this country? So I'm doing what I've always been doing my whole life, is educating myself in the best way I think is possible. And of all the faults of the technological age, one of the few blessings is that we have access to any information you need now, and most people are self-taught, even the ones that are in these institutions. You can learn almost anything they're teaching online now, and maybe it was an aid a few years ago, but now it perhaps is a crutch, and they're wholly dependent on that because these professors don't earn their pay anymore. So if that's what these institutions want to be known for, then that reputation will proliferate in the professional world. My concern is that there's no other opportunities for anyone else like me that would ask for more, ask for better education. And as soon as there's a disagreement, or there needs to be a debate or an open discussion about a hotly debated issue like these mandates, people are going to be excluded and cast out of these institutions, discredited and slandered. And it's really at their own detriment, because if you don't allow open debate in these institutions anymore, then you're setting a precedent that you will have no control over the issues of not just now, in the future, which is why even I caution people that even if we reach a point where we get over COVID, they're conditioning us and they're preparing us for climate lockdowns and whatever economic and social measures they want to impose on us to restrict our freedoms ultimately, which is to the benefit of these corporations and these big businesses that profit from having this extra control in people's lives.
I think that's why it's so important we have to fight this at the school level, at the university level, because we are kind of setting ourselves up for the future. And if we don't fight these issues now, like mandates at the school level, then like you said, they're just teaching people that all of this is okay, so that when they try to implement things in the future, like you said, climate lockdowns, everyone's already complied this, for the last however many years, they're just going to keep complying. That's why making a statement like you have and like other students have is so important, because if we don't change this at the school level, what is this going to do for future generations and for the future of our education? So how do you think we fight this? How do you think we change the culture that's at these schools?
I mean, We can be cautious about our language because at the time of this recording, it's Friday before Saturday when these truckers are convoying on their way to Ottawa, right? And it is a fight, it is a struggle, but it's not the kind of warfare that we've experienced throughout history, or at least not that we were aware of in history. When we make our allusions to history, we pay more attention to the violence rather, well, the physical violence and the destruction of those conflicts, but we forget the social and cultural damage that leads up to these open revolts and conflicts. And that's the kind of fight we're in now. But ultimately, the blessing and a curse of any democratic society is that ultimately they have the freedom to choose. And if this is the path that Canadians choose, then it's to their own detriment, unfortunately. And as long as things are still democratic, we would assume that everyone else would be allowed to live their lives differently. And people can choose between the two. And whoever has the better way of living life, whoever has the better survival mechanism, so to speak, natural selection, nature finds a way, and society will find a way. And you would hope that even if Canada continues down this dark path, there's other democracies around the world, the US especially, but also at this moment in time, the UK, that are going to do things differently. And the summary of their judgment is that they're just going to trust the people, and they will allow them to make decisions for themselves. It seems like Canadians aren't going to be given this opportunity anytime soon. All that needs to be said about that is that we don't have the trust of our government, unfortunately. And if that's something Canadians are willing to live with, fine, but they're going to see the outcome of those decisions, or really their lack of being involved in those decisions. And when it's their other freedoms that they're encroached on that they didn't think they would challenge because of the precedents being established by these mandates, they will live with those consequences. And while we live in poverty and misery and social division, other democracies around the world will be allowed to have open dialogue, confrontation, and opportunities for reconciliation. And if we don't have these opportunities, and if we take it one step further, we impose restrictions and we punish and demonize and scapegoat and discriminate against people that want to live their lives differently. It sucks for people like us, but ultimately it's to their own detriment as well, because they're setting a precedent that if you're not with us, you're against us, and you will never have an opportunity to live differently or live freely.
I think a lot of people don't realize that all of what's going on right now at some point or another is going to affect them. They like to assume that, we're fighting for our rights and our this and that, and they kind of undermine it. But they don't realize that at some point they're going to cross a line for you, and they're going to take something away from you that you don't like anymore, and it's going to start to affect you. And it may not be now, but at some point, if we keep letting this go on, then it's going to affect everyone. It's not just, people who are unvaccinated right now. Who knows what it can be in the future. They start imposing, I don't know, any other kinds of restrictions or mandates for another type of vaccine or medication, or who knows what it is. But I think it's really important to emphasize that, at some point, this is, like you said, it's to their own detriment, right?
Which is why when I spoke at Victoria Park, all I asked of everyone, including the opposition, is just draw your line in the sand and start being honest. And I was very critical of Boris Johnson and his statement in Parliament in the UK, where he said we will trust the people, but that's not how this relationship is meant to work. Power in democratic society comes from the bottom up, not the top down. And it's up to us whether or not we trust our elected officials. And they should have our trust. That's the only thing that substantiates their office to begin with. Having dialogue about our representatives being able to trust us is totally counterproductive and is the epitome of why we're in this situation to begin with. So when I spoke at Victoria Park, I told these people we're asking the wrong questions about whether or not these politicians should trust the general public. It's whether or not we should trust them. And by extension, where does the power of these officials come from? It's from their constituents and their elected bodies, right? Which means, do we trust the people we live and work and get educated amongst, right? And so my appeal to them was that, like, we need to hold these people accountable now, because if you ask someone at the outbreak in 2020 that we would be rolling out third boosters, and yet we would still be forcing everyone that accepts these boosters to still be masked and to still isolate and still test in some circumstances, then people would have said no way, because that was when that would be drawing a line in the sand then. But it's never too late to draw a line in the sand, right? So you can put a number on it and you say, how many boosters are you willing to accept before enough is enough for you? But I also ask people to draw a line in the sand for how much they're willing to impose on people that don't choose to abide by these mandates anymore. And we've reached a point in Quebec where they want to tax people, and they're suggesting that people that do the necessary shopping be escorted, and people don't even have their mask exemptions honoured anymore. I know after I spoke at Victoria Park, I tried to go to the beer store, and right away they said, we have alternative hours for people with mask exemptions. And that's still discrimination. And it's unfortunate for all the people that spent so much time and energy trying to pursue these exemptions, and then they still find they're treated differently or equivalently to people that refuse these vaccines or any of these mandates to begin with. And I would remind people that having alternate business hours is like one of the first measures imposed in Nazi Germany on the Jews. So it's obvious, the comparisons, when they're doing the exact identical things. So we should be asking Canadians, where ultimately the power of our nation comes from, our fellow man, is that the line in the sand for you, where people are not allowed to shop freely and everything else? Or is the line in the sand being put in camps like they have in Australia? Or is the line in the sand when people are rounded up, gagged and blindfolded and put into cargo trains, like I'm sure is happening in Western China? But we don't talk about it because, like I said at the beginning, the West is dependent on the economy, and they don't acknowledge these human right violations in these economies that we're so involved in. And people are under the illusion that we live in a future where we're not gonna make these same mistakes of the past, but we're making them right now. And I would ask that people humble themselves and realize that we're no better than the people that made those mistakes less than a century ago. If anything, it's harder because of all the tools that these regimes, these tyrannical figures in our society have at their disposal. They have even more control over the media than they did before, even more policing, and we're even more dependent on them than ever for all the things that we need for sustenance in life, especially in the cities. So
why do you think that it's become socially acceptable to impose these kind of mandates on people, and a lot of people are just okay with like healthcare workers losing their jobs, or university students not being able to attend school? A lot of people just either ignore it or are just accepting of it. Is that because of the media, or because we were raised in a society to kind of just accept everything? Like, what do you think that?
I think for at least a decade now, we've been suffering under this different kind of pandemic, and they've been talking about these surges in depression, mental illness, social anxiety, eating disorders, and all these kinds of things. And not only have they been swept under the rug these last 2 years because those problems have only been exacerbated by these mandates, but it really conditioned a whole generation of people to be dependent on experts and authority figures to try and diagnose and acknowledge issues that are deeply personal and complicated and can't be summarized and solved with a few hours of counseling and a bit of medication. Ultimately, we lost some core values some point along the way. And being isolated at home and dependent on social media and technology for those answers was not a remedy to those problems. And I like to try and be humble and say I'm young and I lack life and academic experience and I don't have the answers for every individual. But the problem is plain and simple. We are more divided than ever. There is more ignorance and lack of information than ever. And there's more willingness to have dialogue, less willingness to have dialogue about these kinds of confrontations anymore. And it's because not only these last 2 years have we been living our lives isolated and online, but perhaps from more than a decade, at least amongst young people, that should have the most influence on culture at this point. And they are one of the most silent, unfortunately, which is why I would be so happy to hear that despite everything, when our politicians failed us, our medical experts failed us, our lawyers failed us, it was our truckers that came, the least educated, the working class, the blue collar workers that rose to the challenge and finally said enough is enough. And hopefully that would shift attitudes about what a real education is in this country. Like we were talking about earlier, it's not about university. There's so much opportunity for self-study, which is what's informed a lot of my decision making these last 2 years. And rather than study online in isolation, I can do that in any way I want without the associated expense. So I read a lot and I researched a lot, and there's so much you can learn by yourself that you don't need from the approval of these institutions. So I think that's something a lot of, especially young people, have forsaken, that ultimately you can be accountable for the virtues and the kind of life that you want. And if you want a socially free and democratic society, then you need to live by example. And if you want a happy and intellectual society, then you need to be open and have dialogue and be humble and honest in your decisions every day. Because when the majority of young people go out and wear a mask simply because they're pressured to as a social expectation, they're not serving themselves or anyone else. And I would like to flip the narrative on the people that support me and are on side in this issue that still wear a mask publicly, because they don't want people to think that they don't care about public good and they don't care about public safety. That's what they want you to think, and that's how they've dictated the narrative. But we need to flip that around on them ultimately, because I would accuse the people wearing the masks for perpetuating and prolonging this at their own detriment, without being honest and having that discussion with themselves about whether or not they really think it's necessary, whether they feel like they are a danger or they pose a danger to other people, whether or not their vaccines do protect them or not. People don't ask these questions anymore.
No.
And if that's how people live their lives, so be it. But we can live it better, which is why if people ask me what am I up to now, like, I'm living my best life. I sleep great at night, and I know that's not true for a lot of people that still get to be in class, that still get to enjoy more access in society than I do. It's a miserable experience being in that classroom, because ignorance is just allowed to fester. And where ignorance thrives, so does hate, and then so does tyranny. And in that classroom, it's not education. If anything, it's a slump in critical thinking and insight, when people forsake their opportunity to have honest conversations with themselves in their own heads about what is really necessary for function and dialogue and democracy in society. And it's sad to see even people that were more politically aligned with me before this issue bargain with themselves and convince themselves and sell themselves on this idea of the necessary measures and the efficacy of these vaccines, when the proof is clear as daylight that even if we reached 100% vaccination at this point, I would love to hear a conversation from someone on the opposition about how they believe 100% vaccination would really pull us out of this crisis, when we know this virus this constantly mutating flu still is allowed to spread and hospitalize even the triple boosted at this point. So it's really up to students to have that conversation, and I'm having that conversation all the time. That's all I'm doing, and I enjoy it, which is why I'm glad to be here. I'm thankful that you gave me a platform to talk on, and all I could ask is that people just take the time to listen, but also listen to themselves, because like I said at the beginning, it's too much time online, too much time in the media and social media that's controlled by our mainstream, that's controlled by our government. You really need to seek alternative sources of information. And I don't like to talk about the science because it's too easy to discredit someone like that, but it's not even necessary at this point. The proof should be there that if you're vaccinated, you should feel safe and your vaccine should work, if that's your belief. But we're at a point where really the burden is on them to decide how to proceed at this point. Because me and a significant minority in this country have decided I'm going to live life on my terms. And it's up to you whether or not you want to join me or you want to make my life more difficult. And that's the line in the sand that we need to ask Canadians to draw right now before it becomes an expectation.
I feel like you were saying before, there is this social pressure to always be politically correct. For example, wearing a mask, I feel that, like you said, when you were in class, everyone took their mask off when the professor walked out and then put it back on when he walked back in. It's just showing that, oh, I'm a good citizen, I'm complying, I'm wearing this mask, so I don't want anyone to think anything negative about me. There's there's a lot of that out there. And anyone who doesn't necessarily follow the narrative is put under this category of, like, for example, if you are not vaccinated, you're an anti-vaxxer, you're a, right-wing extremist or whatever it is. And people want to avoid being put in that category, so they just kind of follow everyone else. And I wonder how we can change that mindset in a lot of people that maybe are wearing their masks and feel it's unnecessary but just do it anyways. Is it just by non-compliance? Do we just all have to just stop wearing masks and hope that people look at us and do it themselves? Is it how do we get out of this?
I wish it was as simple as that. It was as simple as that 2 years ago. But you will see what happens, how far you can get without a mask. I lasted a month without disclosing my vaccination status, and then I lasted 2 months without disclosing my vaccination status, but I only lasted 1 day without wearing a mask, right? Because it's that public statement that is the most damning and critical, because there's no way to provide evidence to substantiate the fact that I was a public threat, that I was a vector for disease, and that people were getting sick because of my actions. But what they can quantify is that when I'm in a room without a mask, I'm saying to everyone else that I'm comfortable and I feel safe. And I would ask that anyone else in that room that feels the same way to do the same thing. But now we're at a point where, like you say, it's socially unacceptable, because for the last 2 years, it's been socially acceptable. And how did we get to this point? Shouldn't we been educating our youth better? Shouldn't we in elementary and high school been telling students like not to give in to peer pressure and to pledge to end bullying and all those pledges? But we did those things. We said like we would not be the kind of society that would succumb to groupthink and be part of an echo chamber of thoughts and ideas, and that we would all think for ourselves and we wouldn't allow bad ideas to fester and dominate our lives. And yet it happened. And that tells you everything about how you value their education up until the high school level, and unfortunately at the university level, because they pay for that, and they're paying for something that they don't want anymore, because it's not only the expectations of their peers, but also their families. How terrible that it is that I visited a family last night who had 2 boys in high school in grade 12, and those boys were telling me about kids in their year that don't want to get this third booster but their parents are giving them ultimatums that if they don't, that they won't have a house to live under anymore.
I've heard too many stories like that.
And there's all kinds of stories, and there's other stories very similar to mine that don't get reported on, but are shared with me all the time. And all I could hope for is to give people that platform to elevate their story and their status to the same level I receive. Because if we really took full account of how many people have had this mistreatment, like me, it would probably, hopefully, reawaken a lot of Canadians' consciousness and empathy, the things that we used to value. And I guess my critics would say we need to have empathy for the people that have suffered at the hands of this virus. But we did that for a year, and we unrolled these measures to protect people, including this vaccine. And if it was a great idea, it wouldn't require enforcement. If masks worked, then people that weren't wearing masks would get sick and learn from their lessons and wear masks. If people that didn't get vaccinated ended up hospitalized and died, then there would be fewer and fewer of us every day. But that's not the case. In fact, there's more and more of us every day. And it really isn't about science anymore. It really is overcoming those flaws in people, the most basic flaws that have got us into all kinds of trouble for our history, which is ignorance, which leads to hate, which leads to arrogance. Because I caution people on our side that we have to be humble and be prepared for the fact that we may never be redeemed or acknowledged, have our suffering acknowledged, and have justice for the injustices we've suffered. Because ultimately, if the blame isn't on us, then it's going to shift to the people that participated and prolonged this problem. And I am worried that is going to leave us worse off than we are now, because that is a significant majority of people. And as we've seen, the average person is not equipped to make decisions on morality, or they have a complete disregard for morality. And if we come to a consensus that people that were wearing masks and getting vaccinated made the wrong decision and prolonged unnecessary suffering that we don't talk about regarding mental illness and adverse vaccine effects, we're doomed to repeat the same process of people suffering at the hands of a mental illness and all those kinds of things that got us in this rut to begin with. So I would encourage people to just seek the things that we all want at the end of the day, which is an end to these mandates, but and to return to honesty, truth, reconciliation, empathy, compassion. And those things start when we can acknowledge both our parts in this. And there's so much we could say about the faults of the people on the opposition that prolonged this, but I, for my part, have failed some of my friends who I have cut off because we were at odds about this vaccine issue. Because that's really where we and I could have done the most help and accomplished the most progress in winning people over and undoing this mandate. Because I am just one person, and I can't be the tip of the spear in unraveling this narrative. It needs to really be a majority of people that say, this is enough for me. And we start by having those conversations with people that are at that tipping point, are reaching their limit, and they don't want that fourth booster, and they want to return to normalcy. Because at the end of the day, the decisions are in the hands of everyday people and actions. And if you want it to stop, you just take off the mask and it's over. You don't need the permission of any authority figure or government to live the life you want to live. And as soon as we get people to remember that, then the sooner we'll be heading in a direction that's a lot better for every Canadian. And if they want a mask, that's up to them. If they need a vaccine, that's up to them. But everyone else should be allowed to refuse that. And we shouldn't have prejudice against people that get vaccinated or choose to be masked or isolated, the same way I would ask people that make those decisions to not be prejudiced against people that don't take those kind of guidelines and recommendations from authority figures. Because ultimately everyone's accountable for their own actions. And it's not just the politicians, it's not just the university admins, it's not just the professors. It's ultimately the students as well. It's your friends and it's your
Mhm.
family, and they're all accountable.
Mhm. I think having those conversations with people face to face is so important, really sitting down and explaining this to them. Because I think that you're right, there is a lot of ignorance, and there's a lot of people that just shut all of this out and just think, "Well, I'm just going to do as I'm told." But when you bring up all these points, I hope that most people are, I don't know, have the ability to see everything that's going on, and how at the end of the day, if we want this ends, all of this ends when the majority of us say it ends, right?
Hmm.
I think we're starting to see that a little bit with this truckers protest. You can see that there's quite a large number of Canadians that are coming together for this. That I really, I think it brings a lot of people hope that there is quite a few of us. But then again, it's also being undermined by the media and by other Canadians, and being tarnished in every way that they can. And there's always that side that always tries to undermine every single part of this movement, I guess, against these mandates, no matter what it is.
Hmm.
Do you think that there's like, those people ever going to change? Is it just pure ignorance? Do they not want to accept the fact that maybe they were wrong?
Mm. Well, I'd like to think that you know the double-edged sword of democracy is that bad ideas are allowed to prosper,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the free market, right? And anyone that argues against the free market would say, um, there's always opportunity for exploitation, and that's where we're at, where we would hope that in a fair and competitive environment, bad ideas are allowed to fail and good ideas are allowed to succeed. This is not the same comparison because, as you're seeing, good ideas are being disproportionately, they're given a huge disadvantage. And obviously, the analogy I'm going with here is that people that want to be part of a control group that doesn't get vaccinated, doesn't mask and isolate, they're treated much differently than everyone else. So that we'll never be able to prove that life can go on as normal because we're not allowed to live lives normally, but neither are they. So it's up to them really because they have
Mm-hmm.
the power. But where do these people come from? Well, they live and thrive under the protection of the people that fought for these institutions to begin with. The very best of us, the best and bravest and most courageous and passionate, fought and died in wars to protect these values against the kind of tyranny that wanted these kinds of uh, regulations and infringements on our freedom
Mm-hmm.
and liberties. So we've had a good maybe 80 years or so, but the same old problems are back where there's a crisis, real or imagined, and we're looking for radical solutions, and people take advantage and exploit. And we've lived with COVID for 2 years now. The majority of people that would have suffered under this have unfortunately been lost. And by now, anyone that can survive COVID has had COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And that traditionally, before the science changed in these last 2 years, should have been enough to protect these people. But instead of acknowledging that the institutions that were responsible for protecting the most vulnerable in our society, the ailing, the people with comorbidities, and the very eldest in our society that suffered the most, where were the protections and allowances for them, right? And they shifted that responsibility onto a majority of us when a misconception and a different scientific doctrine about how we protect these people is that we isolate ourselves and essentially behave the exact same way as these people that are as much danger to this virus as the people that, like the 99%, as the statistic upholds, can shake off and live with these kind of flu outbreaks ultimately. But as we've seen, people have taken a turn for the worse, not just mentally, but physically. We didn't live and come to dominate this planet by hiding and trying to limit our exposures to the dangers in this world. Our immune systems are fantastic because we expose ourselves and fight these things off. And it's isolated communities like these tribal human ancestors that live off the coast of India, I believe, that have never had exposure to the modern world, that they would die probably from the common cold. And limiting our exposure has made us more vulnerable to these illnesses. I had the worst bout of allergies I've ever had in my whole life, and so did a lot of people from spending so much time indoors these last 2 years, and that applies to everything else. So people that get the worst flu they've ever had this year should realize that it's not necessarily because of how bad this virus is, but because of how bad our health decisions have been in trying to fight off these viruses and refusing, and the medical professionals have been advised against providing alternative treatment for these viruses. And anyone that did has been cast out of their roles in a medical setting or a professional or research setting, which is the tragedy.
Yeah, the doctors and the medical professionals have really been censored or been threatened with losing their licenses, and I don't know how a majority of people can see that and still believe that this is all about health. Like you were saying, we were in isolation for a good part of the last 2 years, and that deteriorates your mental and physical health. And then of course when you go outside and finally things open up again, no wonder people start getting sick if they haven't been exposed to anything. Like, how can we see all of this and still assume that it's about health? I don't know. Again, how do we change that mindset of people to wake up to the fact that maybe the government doesn't care about us? Because I feel like I've spoken to quite a few people who are like, oh, they just don't know. This is a new situation for the government and they just don't know what they're doing, so it's not going to be perfect. But why would they do anything to hurt us? Like how...
That's just hopeful thinking, right? That's the same kind of thinking that lead people to realize things are too late, right? And that's why let's draw a line in the sand now. Because I want to know where these people are that think it's okay, because they're out there. They're only a radical minority right now, but they may become a silent majority where they think it's okay to convince these people to line themselves up and stand in a ditch ready to be shut down because they've been deemed unclean and a liability in society, which is why we can't invest too much hope in, I think we're estimating like 500,000 truckers, but we'll find out by the time this is published. And I sincerely hope they succeed in turning this narrative around. But ultimately, if we really have 500,000 truckers appearing in Ottawa, that's fantastic. But what would be even better than that is those 500,000 people having 500,000 conversations with 500,000 silent people that don't want to talk about this issue. Because, like you say, they've invested too much and they have too much trust in government. And that's where we fail. And we forget, people aren't educated to remember, or they're deliberately uneducated to forget where the power of government comes from. And it's from the people. And in a fair market, in a fair democratic system, these systems would preserve themselves. But like we say, anytime we give people that trust, there's always opportunity for exploitation. And we would hope these people aren't allowed to thrive because people among them or under them or above them would hold them accountable for making these poor decisions based on health or public policy. But we don't get these opportunities because on an individual level, medical professionals, politicians, students are cast out and ridiculed for having a different stance. And in a broader sense, like there are no universities that have a different mandate. After I'm sure some conversation happened in the back room in Ottawa, and all these universities together and agreed on what policies they would and would not impose for the benefit of these politicians, who were more than happy to impose these mandates because I don't doubt they got a slice of the profits from Big Pharma. So because there was never a university that was allowed to do anything different, or a business is not allowed to conduct itself differently, that's not a fair market model. That's market infringement, that's manipulation, that's the kind of exploitation that allows consumers to suffer. And we're talking about people that want to get educated, and there's no other options to get educated except self-education. But that doesn't hold much merit because, again, most professional employers, most government employers, not only do you need this vaccine, but you need government-approved education to get these placements in society. And what hope is there for people like us that want alternatives, and we're going to be barred and restricted by all this red tape that doesn't allow people to open their own businesses or their own academic institutions that allow people to do things differently? And I'd be extremely speculative of like imposing mandates on even medical workers, nurses and doctors, because we don't have an opportunity for a hospital to do it differently. Because ultimately, my belief is that people that really care about the medicine would have critically evaluated it and decided it's not necessary. And although they're excluded from our government-approved healthcare, there would be opportunities for them in private health like there is in the States. And we would see how those hospitals are allowed to outperform public health, which is why in a fair market, in a fair democracy, there would be options, but it doesn't seem like there are very many options at this point. And we have provincial elections this year, but I'm not optimistic because, as we saw in the previous year, we had a federal election, and what choice did we have? We had someone that wanted to prolong the mandates, and our alternative was a guy that wanted to put in the War Measures Act. It really seems like you only had a one-party system and you were just picking the lesser of two evils. And all these guys get together, all these political opponents, Singh, O'Toole, Trudeau, when they all stand in the room and they say the exact same thing, we're all in this together, where is the competitive divergence in beliefs about hotly debated issues? Do we still vote on the old issues? Because there only seems to be one issue in this country, and there's no alternative vote for people that are not happy with these mandates anymore.
I don't think there is much hope in, the politicians ending this. We can't just vote someone in who's going to change everything. I think we need to, like you said before, having these conversations is so important because at the end of the day, this is a cultural battle that we're facing, and we have to open the minds of the people around us because, the government's going to try and do whatever they want to do. At the end of the day, we can't stop that. But what we can stop is them implementing it if we have the numbers and if we have enough people willing to actually say, no, you know what, this is enough. So what do you have to say to people listening to this that they're like, okay, what can I do in this? How can I do my part to, make a little bit of change or to step out of my comfort zone and do something against what everyone else is doing? Do you have any, a message for...
There's so many things that people can do. And I have to caution people, this trucker convoy alone is not going to save us. My case, I can't say too much about my legal case, but my one legal case is not going to save us. My actions are not going to save everyone. Ultimately, people have to save themselves, but they don't have to do it all the same way. I'm not heading to this convoy. There's other ways I can contribute to this issue. And this, like I just said, you can advocate for this large group of like-minded people to congregate and demonstrate, but they could also go out and have those conversations. And that's what I'm personally good at. I talk to people. I was doing this long before people knew my name. I was having these conversations deep in enemy territory in the hospital and in the university. And that's where those conversations need to happen. And that's one thing you can do. You can go out and drive in these convoys and appear on Ottawa Hill. You can walk into class where you've been restricted and be arrested and accept the charges. Someone sent me a beautiful quote by Martin Luther King, and I'll paraphrase that: people that have the most love and passion and respect for the law, when fighting an unjust law, should accept the responsibilities and the punishment of fighting that law. And that was my original intent, because I never expected my name to get as much traction as it did. And I wanted to pursue it to its end. I wanted to know if we were a kind of country where we were willing to arrest and imprison people simply for attending the classes they've paid for. And I could hope that I would be a martyr in that case and that people would rally to my story. But I've got more than that, and people have rallied to the fact that simply I got arrested. And that was a line in the sand for a lot of other people. But there may be people right now that already serve jail sentences for their actions, and that's a terrifying prospect. But how much freedom do you have compared to people that sit in a jail cell if you're like me? I can't go to most places without this vax pass, and if this goes on, I'm going to be faced with financial penalization, and I'm going to be escorted everywhere I go. And who knows what other restrictions they may impose if we deal with this for another year or so. I think you may have more freedom in a jail cell, but I'm not asking people to go out and get themselves arrested. Just do the things that you want to do. And if you're as passionate and adamant about fighting this as I am, then do it in the way that best comforts you. Participate in these convoys, get arrested in class, go to the grocery store without a mask. The family I was with last night, they have great enjoyment from, they play along and they say they're exempt and that they have to maintain social distancing, but by being deliberately difficult and trying to claw back inches of the society we used to be, by inviting people to come close to us and to realize they're undermining their own efforts to limit the spread for the sake of social convenience. Any measure we undertake to limit the spread or to control a crisis should be socially convenient. The only social inconvenience that this virus poses is illness or death. But there's a lot of illness and death that doesn't get mentioned because of these, because of all the best efforts to restrict this. So you can appear in grocery stores without a mask, or any business without a mask. I haven't worn a mask since I was in that classroom, and I know it's so difficult for people that have these fiscal responsibilities, and they have children and they have bills to pay. And I'm only lucky in that regard that I don't have to wear a mask. But a lot of people do, because they feel like they have obligations or responsibilities to people that matter more to them than their own integrity and values in society. But ultimately, I would ask those people, what kind of culture are you building by participating in that? Because your kids are only going to inherit that culture. So I would ask people to try their best to try and find employment where they're valued and they're not discriminated against because of their values, because of the medical decisions they exercise. And there's so many other ways that people fight this that even I'm not willing to do. Behind the scenes, behind these cameras, there are people that do the grueling work of organizing these productions, organizing podcasts, writing letters, writing open letters, drafting appeals to local representatives, the highest levels of government, and having conversations online and hosting online forums for people to congregate and have these interactions. There's so much people can do. So I don't think there really is an excuse about what is really required to get this done. It's a combined effort. As long as we're all doing something, then something is being done. The worst thing we could be doing is doing nothing.
All right. Thank you so much for that. I think it's time we wrap up. I think we've reached our hour. So thank you for joining us today. If anyone listening would like to find out more about Concerned Students of Ontario, visit csont.ca. or head to any of our social media pages and contact us. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.